The Fourth Turning. It's a book that was written by Howe and William Strauss. William Strauss already passed away, so he's no longer able to speak on the topic, but Howe is still around, and he talks a lot about this generational theory that they came up with and how it kind of like reveals patterns and cycles within different generations, so like millennials, boomers, the things you usually think of when you think of the word generation, and also like cycles of history. Essentially, Strauss and Howe came up with this analysis that they saw over the past like couple centuries of American history, at least since like late 1600s is kind of like the start of their analysis. They saw that essentially every 80 to 90 years, the world would go through a big shift. It's like every 20 to 25 years, there's almost like a new phase or turning. Then when you reach the end of those like 4 seasons of history, the world kind of gets reshaped and you like start all over.
The turnings are important because they have very different societal, economic, and political views. So that's why we're diving into this now, I feel like, because it's such a tumultuous time.
Yeah, they called it like seasons, kind of thinking of it as like spring is like the first turning. So that's like when it's the high, like everything's great. It's basically right after a big crisis. So the whole world has come together to like create new institutions. There's more a community-based kind of feeling because they just went through this like really big struggle together. So it's all like in it for each other kind of thing, and things are thriving. Then you have the summertime when things are kind of like peaking. And because things are so good, then people are starting to be like, wait, why do I care about the collective? I want to like find myself. So it's about like individualism then. And so then things like start kind of being questioned. There's like more kind of cultural upheaval during that time. So you can kind of think of like the hippies and like the free love kind of time when they're trying to, break free from institutions. Then when it comes to fall is the unraveling. So that's the third turning. And that's when like shit starts hitting the fan and like things are crumbling more. And eventually that leads to the winter, which is the fourth turning, which is crisis. And what is fascinating to me, why I was like, I'm interested in this topic, is they're like, we are in the fourth turning, like we're in the crisis time period right now, according to their theory. And apparently, according to them, it started at like 2008, essentially, like when the big first financial crisis happened and is still ongoing now. And there's no like for sure end date yet of this crisis, but like for me at least, I feel like you faux show can feel it. Like it's so tense right now. Like you said, like the world is in chaos right now, and it's like, when is it gonna peak? Have we peaked?
Well, if it's every 20 to 30 years, it should end in about 10 years. So in 10 years, we should be back to the high cycle.
Yeah, so I was fascinated by it because I was like, it feels like we're living through history when it's framed that way. So it's really cool. And I'm excited to see kind of like what that spring, the next high looks like.
I just generally like discussing these things because I find it really fascinating when people do like meta-analysis on large groups. But then on the other hand, I also have like this kind of thing where it's like, you can't define me. The main lesson I took out of Psychology 101 in college is that you're less consistent than you think you are. Like everyone thinks that they have these sets of like, this is who I am, this is how I behave, like this is how I act. And it's consistently proven that people are less consistent than they think they are. So it's always interesting to me when you see this thing that's like, people of this like group are like this, and I'm like, are they though? Like, because everyone is faking it a little bit. So I'm always curious to discuss these things because it's really fun, intellectual salon conversation.
Which is a good segue into the other half of their theory, which is around generations and generational archetypes. Kind of what you're saying, it's like you're not as special as you think you are, or maybe you are. I don't think anyone, including them who created the theory, I don't think they're trying to say that like everyone is exactly the same within a generation. But I think it's pretty undeniable to say that like within a generation, you have a lot of things in common in terms of like the things you care about, the way you act. And basically the way that they talk about it is like each generation fits within a certain archetype that they've come up with, obviously like the names of them, but it's defined by like certain traits that they have that are defined by how they grew up. Basically, the generational archetypes and the way that we all act is a result of when in the historical world turnings, we grow up, when we come of age, when we become old, because whether we grew up in a time of crisis or a time of like highs affects the way that our parents brought us up, and therefore our like outlook on life when we were young. And if we end up being like really in it for the community or being like rebellious and not trusting institutions. So it is super fascinating to me to see this like essentially the crossover of which season of life you are in and which season of life like the world is in, and how that all shapes you. That's kind of like the completion of their theory. I didn't name all the archetypes, but like essentially it's like every generation has like certain traits, and then it's like cyclical. So they mention like most people have a lot more in common with their grandparents than they do with their parents, because their parents always tried to raise them the opposite way from the way they were raised. So then it makes sense that like it would skip a couple generations later with the grandparents and grandkids.
There's this idea that the political pendulum, just swings back and forth every couple of years. And I definitely feel that, where it's like you go one direction, then people are like, oh, no, went too far, course correct. Then you go the other direction, and it's kind of just like a ping pong tennis match where you just kind of bounce back and forth between these two ends of something.
What I also liked was, again, this idea that we are more similar to a previous generation than we think we are, because I think a lot of times, especially with young people, we often think we're like special snowflakes, and that like our experiences are so distinct that like no one gets us, and we're in like such a different thing than like the boomers or whatever, that like there's no way they could understand why we care about certain things or the way that we act. But actually, according to their theory, like I said, like you would have a lot more in common with your grandparents than with your parents. I selfishly picked apart just the generational parallels that affect us and like the younger generation. So we're both millennials. So millennials are more in line with the GI generation, or the greatest generation, which is real old people. The age group is 1901 to 1927. So they're actually older than like Biden. Biden's actually in the generation after that. This is the heroes generation. That's the archetype. Heroes are the ones who were born after the awakening. So I guess if spring is the awakening, we're like the summer. When we grew up, it was a time when people were shifting more into like individualism. So because that was the way we were raised, we actually veer the other way, where we're more team oriented, and we're like really civic duty oriented, and like trying to like work together to do better for the group. We become like midlife, which is often how they talk about it, as like the kind of like important time. Basically when you're like an adult that can like make change happen for like the world. So I think they said like mid-20s to mid-40s or something is kind of like midlife. So this is the time when we're like apparently really aggressive advocates for things like economic prosperity, public optimism, civic energy, and all this stuff, which I think is pretty in line. According to the video I watched, Tony Robbins, he was the co-host of the video that I was watching. He was like, I'm really excited for millennials because they're the heroes and they're going to be the ones who like fix all the shit that's about to break. It's because the people in power now are so freaking old. They're the silent generation, which brings me to their parallel is actually Gen Z. Silent generation, which is what Biden is part of. They're the artists.
Oh, they are artists.
Archetype. Yeah, artist,
okay.
Archetype. Boomers are before Gen X, and then silent generation, which is Biden.
Oh,
is
Biden's
before
boomer. Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
okay.
I know, right? Because
She's
I feel
old as
like
fuck.
in social or like pop culture things, boomers are like the oldest people we can think
It's just
of.
like anyone over 60 is a boomer.
That's what I think of too. I know, right? But no, apparently, because it's like
Yeah.
20 to 25 years, which makes sense.
Fair.
But yeah, I was like, wait, Biden's not a boomer, and he's not.
No,
He's part
I
of
guess
silent
not.
generation,
Okay.
which is like 1923 to 1943 is when those people were born. But apparently, these folks, the artist archetype, are the ones who grew up during crisis. So because you're a child or like really young during crisis, your role during that time in the world is to just like shut up and like don't cause trouble. So apparently because of that, they are more quiet and conformity oriented, where they don't want to rock the boat, and they're actually more likely to want to change themselves to please other people or to like make things easier for the group, which is interesting. The positives that they named, which I think is like pretty on par with what I've been seeing with Gen Z, is like they're caring, they're open-minded, and they're more willing to look at nuance and like distinguishing between things.